And so now we're going to begin. The first thing that I want to talk about tonight is land acknowledgement. We've had some questions from people about why we have been doing a land acknowledgement and what that means. And so this is just kind of for information that land acknowledgements are our traditional custom that date back centuries in many in many Native nation communities. Today, land acknowledgements are used by Native people and non-natives to recognize Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the lands on which we now live. To have meaning, one needs to think about the words, not just give it lip service. And that's been one of the concerns that people have had. If you think about whether or not you recite the Pledge of Allegiance, whether you sing the national anthem, or whether you go to church and there's certain prayers that you always say, sometimes we don't think about what the words are that we're saying and what the meaning is. And so that's just something that we should be thinking about. We know that people were here on Chebeague thousands of years ago, way before the Europeans arrived. And we know it because we have middens and we found artifacts all around the island. So we know that people were here long before maybe our ancestors or those first Europeans. So again, let's think about the words and possible actions as we acknowledge those who came before us. We recognize that we are on the homeland of the Wabanaki tribal nation who stewarded the land for thousands of years. We support their descendants in their efforts to protect the land and water and for cultural healing and recovery. For more information, if you're interested in how you can help and more information about land acknowledgements, the WabanakIReach.org is a great organization and their headquarters are in Brunswick, Maine. So that being said, we now are going to go to the Chebeague Island Historical Society presents an Ellsworth Miller Memorial Lecture. And I just wanted to make a couple of comments before we start that as I was putting this lecture together, I realized that this is really a personal lecture because it tells my story of living on Chebeague for the last 73 years, because it really covers that period. And as I was writing it and gathering information, I realized that I lived through a lot of what I was writing about. And sometimes if you're too close to a subject, it does become personal. So I want you all to know that with that lens, I'm not necessarily using my historian lens, but so if I get a little emotional or whatever, it's because this is really my story, as well as many other people who lived it at the same time. I want to talk a little bit about the Ellsworth Miller Memorial Lecture. This was started by Cap Leonard, and it's in memory of my father, for those who don't know. And my father was in the Merchant Marine during World War II. He was a mariner his whole life and a fisherman. And he inspired Cap as a boy when he would come home. So I just kind of put some pictures in here that so that some of you would have some idea of who Ellsworth Miller was. And so one is in his Merchant Marine outfit. The other one is at the Smithsonian, and he said that he went to sea because of that poster that he's standing in front of. And the other is standing there with my son when the day that he received a medal from the Russian government for his service in during World War II of taking supplies to Murmansk and helped to keep Russia in the war. Okay, so now we're on to the content of the lecture. Now, if you didn't see parts 1 and 2 of Education on Chebeague, and I'm starting to actually see a pattern. I've had multiple parts to the last few lecture series that I've done. I had 4 parts to the church, 2 or 3 parts to organizations, and this is the final part for education, part 3. Our other parts 1 and 2 should be on our website. So if you didn't see those, you can easily go there and see those lectures. And so I've called this How Educational Decisions Changed the Course of Chebeague's History, 1945 to 2024. So the beginning of it's a little bit of a review of the end of lecture 2, because I wasn't sure people would remember exactly where we were at that point. And it's really helps to give you some context for what happened during the 1950s on. Okay, we're having a little bit of oh, there we go. All right, and so now for the rest of the story. At the end of the last lecture, I put these kind of teasers out there and said we weren't going to be talking about them then, but at the next lecture we would. So be thinking about these as we go through this talk tonight. How the Chebeague kids made out at Portland High School. How did they end up at Greeley? What happened to the Chebeague Junior High? What was it like to cut ice in a wooden boat while on one's way to school? How a school decision resulted in secession? How Chebeague students ended up in Yarmouth, and more. So let's look back. So when you, the PTA was very active during the World War II. Those were the people who had stayed here and hadn't gone abroad, hadn't joined the military. A lot of women were involved and some of the older men. And they wanted the community to be strong when the soldiers and sailors came back after World War II. So they had established a PTA, and it was very obvious that the PTA had more to do than just talk about education. So that is, during that process is when the Chebeague Island Council was created. And their first project was to renovate a house for the doctor. And at the same time, the PTA was lobbying for a new school. And so you see here the picture, the house on the East End, across from the hotel, and it's where the hotel owns it now, and it is where they keep some of their helps live there. But after World War II, it was the doctor's house, and you see there's a signpost that says physician. And before that, it was the Summit House, which was a summer boarding house. So there was an educational transition after World War II. The picture on the left shows the Chebeague Island High School in about 1951. And then you see the new school, which was called the Consolidated School, because it consolidated the East End School, the West End School, and the Central School into one sub-primary through 12th grade school. And it opened in 1953. And there are 53 students in the picture on the right of the day that they started. So this is really the transition into after World War II. And people on Chebeague were very proud of this school. They were, they had a big celebration to dedicate the school. They were happy because this was the first time they had a school that had a bathroom and running water, hot lunch, had a beautiful kitchen for those days, and they had running water. They didn't have to run for water, and that's what they had to do before. They had to actually go and someplace, get water and bring it back in order to cook. The school board came to the dedication and the superintendent, and Hamilton's mother, Ann Comlosi, was our representative. She is in the very front. And on the left is Mabel Wilson. If you are familiar with in Cumberland, the Mabel Wilson School is named for her. On the right, standing, is Bill Soul, who was the principal, the superintendent of schools at the time, who ultimately made the decision we're going to hear about later. And I have to tell you, this is an aside, as an undergraduate, he was one of my professors for teaching social studies in the secondary school. When he found out I lived on Chebeague, he said, "Do the people there still hate me?" And so you'll know why he asked me that in a minute. So in this school, in 1953, there were grades. One room had grades subprimary through 4, and this is 2 pictures of that same classroom. And there was another room that was grades 5 through 8, and then 2 rooms were the high school. In 1954, they had their first graduating class from this school. And it was shortly after that Bill Soul, the superintendent, and the school committee recommended closing the Island School. And that is why the Island High School. And that is why Bill Soul wanted to know if people still hated him on Chebeague. And they expected the population at the high school was 12, and they expected it to go to 6. And they were concerned that there wasn't enough variety in the curriculum, and they had a lot of other reasons, but a lot of it had to do with money, that it was costing them money. And a quote from the newspaper said that the high school is located in part of the $50,000 Island Consolidated School that was built in 1953. So they had just built that school, and all of a sudden they want to eliminate the high school, half of the school. And their idea was that if they sent them to Portland High School, they could save $4,000 a year. And remember, we're talking about a different kind of money than we have now. There's all kinds of newspaper clippings. If you've read the New Sloops log, there's a very detailed account of this whole story. But if you have the ability to look at Portland newspapers, there's a lot of information out there about how people on Chebeague felt about losing what they felt was losing the high school. But the Islanders prevailed, so that the class of 1955 would not be the last class at CHS. They said, okay, we'll go for another year. And so these were the people who graduated in 1955. And then they brought it back again. They said, they decided that they wanted to try again to close the school, hoping that there wouldn't be as much angst from the people in Chebeague. And so it was during that discussion when the people in Chebeague realized that the time had come that they really were going to close the school, that they decided to go to Augusta and see if they could get a bridge, because they were worried about the survival of the community. So you see there's a quote here in the middle. It was also decided to send a 50-member delegation to Augusta Wednesday for a hearing on the resolution calling for the State Highway Commission to study the desirability of bridges and causeways connecting Little John's Island and Chebeague Island in Casco Bay with the mainland. And that is in the same article that says Chebeague issue on school to go to town meeting. So they were between a rock and a hard place. And this isn't really a talk about the bridge, which that could be another whole talk, but here's a map which shows you where the bridge was going. It was going to go off from what is some people call Bar Point. If you get down below Juniper Lodge, it was going off there over to Little John's, and then going to across the causeway to Cousins Island. And there was a brochure put out at the time, and the stepping stone to prosperity was part of their slogan. to hopefully get a bridge. So these are intimately connected, the losing the high school and the initiative for a bridge. So they finally, gave up. They knew they had been outvoted at town meeting. Oop, we just went the wrong way here. So the headlines: exercises tonight, Chebeague Island graduation, maybe high school's last. Betsy Ross only and possibly last Chebeague High School graduate. And here's a picture of Betsy. They decided that even though there was just Betsy as a senior in the senior class, they would do the same thing they had done for every other graduate, every other group the year before. 6 had graduated, and they had the whole graduation ceremony and the community dance, and everybody had the beautiful dresses and the bouquets of roses. And so Betsy had the same as everybody else, even though it was just one of her. And one of the frustrations for the people on Chebeague was that the Cumberland School Department and the superintendent wouldn't look at any of the numbers of the students who were actually in the classes below the high school. For example, I was in sub-primary at that year in a class of 9. So there were 9 of us coming up through that school, and that wasn't considered. They didn't even look at the kids who were going to go into high school and included them as part of the numbers. It's very interesting that Betsy's father, Bill, was a member of the class of 1936, which was the Chebeague High School's largest class. And he came back to school in 1927. This was probably in either part 1 or part 2. In 1927, they changed the high school to a 2-year high school. And so Bill in 1932 had graduated from 10th grade, and that's as far as you could go. But when they opened it, they decided to go to a 4-year high school again in 1934. He came back. So that was something that he and Betsy, he was in really that first class, and she was in the last class of the second round of Chebeague High School. And here, this was the entire high school on Chebeague in 1956. You see Betsy there in the center, and it's Mary Weber on the left, Lois Hamilton, Betsy, Joyce Hamilton, and Rodney Hamilton. And in September 1956, those 4 would be heading off to Portland High School. And that's the next part of our story. So how did the kids make out after the Chebeague High School closed? Well, they had to consider the people who were in 8th grade coming up. And so all of a sudden you see the numbers are bigger. And the names of these people came from a newspaper clipping, and it described where the people were that next year. And that would be the fall and winter of 1956. So we had Harold Cleves, Charlotte Hinkle, Pam Johnson, Mary Weber, and Lois Hamilton were all riding the Casco Bay boat every morning. Helen Leonard had gone over to Cumberland and was boarding with a Blanchard family and going to Greeley. Gail Hamilton's family, Ray Hamilton was her father. They got an apartment in Portland, and they lived in Portland. And Joyce and Rodney lived with their sisters, Sylvia and Audrey, or maybe it was Audrey and Theron in Portland in an apartment, and they'd come home weekends. And so that's what the fall of 1956 looked like. And this is how they went to school, in the Gurnett and other Casco Bay boats. So how did they make out at Portland High School? That is the question. Portland High School in the 1950s. This is a picture from the Portland Public Library archives from the mid-1950s. So you see all the people coming and going. People had cars there. And if you don't know where Portland High School is, it's still in the same location on Cumberland Avenue. So these kids went from an island high school of 5 students to a city high school of more than 800 and with more than 200 in a class. Now, if you can't think about the culture shock of just seeing that many people in the school. So in the fall of 1957, there was the lure of the city. So if you look at this picture to the left, that's an elementary school picture on Chebeague. And most of these kids were impacted by this change. I'm not going to go through and try to name everybody. This is just the big piece of this. But we have the Porthole restaurant here. Now, that's the way the Porthole used to look back quite a while ago. They've really cleaned up their act. And my father used to say, let's go to the Porthole and have a feed of flies. But now it's a little more upscale than that. But in the fall of 1957, Ernie Burgess, Kenny Campbell, and Lawson Dowdy and Lindy Smith started to go to high school, along with the ones who we've already talked about. Now, to let you know that I actually did interviews with Ernie Burgess, Lindy Smith, Charlotte Hinkle, and Judy Dowdy for this program, this lecture. And I'd like to really dedicate this to Judy. And they all had incredible stories to tell me about what it was like to go from Chebeague to Portland High School. And Ernie's over and over, he would say, we were awful, just awful. And now you'll, kind of hear some of the things. So in 1958, you had another group heading to go. Now, remember, they closed the high school because there were no kids in the school, and you're seeing these cohorts of, groups of people. And so based on the numbers, there probably would have been close to 20 kids if they had let them keep on going, if they hadn't closed it. They were just looking for a reason. But the dissatisfaction was mounting with Portland High School and the CBL option. And this is the year that Jackie Trask graduated and Judy from 8th grade on Chebeague. And they had 8th grade graduations. And you can see how they were hanging out in the classroom. They had a record player and that kind of thing. And in the newspaper, it tells the different parts that everyone had. And so just in this picture, we have Marshall Bowen, Billy Riddle, Scotty Haw, Judy, and Jackie. Sanford was very concerned. Sanford Dowdy was very concerned about what was happening with the kids going to Portland High School. And one of the things that was happening is some of them were not going to Portland High School as much as they should have. There was the lure of the pinball machines at the Porthole, bowling alleys, and also pool halls. And there were other kids from other islands, and they were more savvy. And as some of these guys will tell you, it was quite an adventure to go and spend the day roaming around Portland. And if you've read the Sloop's Log, you've heard this story, but I'll tell it for those people who haven't. That one of my favorite stories that I remember hearing when I was a kid, and Ernie confirmed it. There was a kid from Peaks Island who the truant officer was always after him. And so what he did was he got a job working as Mr. Peanut. And if you know Planters Peanuts, they had a guy that had this costume. And when I was a kid, he was wandering around Portland. Come to find out, he was a different person probably every day, but he was going around and handing out peanuts as an advertisement. So this kid got the job of Mr. Peanut for the day, and he followed the truant officer all around Portland. So that's the kinds of stories that those guys can tell about what was happening. And so you can see why people like Sanford were concerned that, and a lot of the other parents were concerned that that they weren't really getting the kind of education that they needed. So it also, so Sanford started lobbying for a Cousins Greeley option, having a boat that would go from the Stone Wharf to Cousins Island. And he was unsuccessful. And so because of it, Jackie was collateral damage and had to go. They found a place for her to board in South Portland, and she went to South Portland High School. So this, you can see there's a pattern here of breaking up the cohorts of kids who grew up together. And one's going to a private school, one's going to Greeley, one's going to South Portland, somebody's going, wherever. And it was really difficult for a lot of those kids. This just helped to make the bridge concept even more, the people became more enthusiastic about having a bridge, thinking, okay, if we have a bridge, then at least we can, get our kids back and forth to school, even if they can't go to school on Chebeague. And at the same time, people started to become concerned about the fact that they had younger kids that they didn't want to be going on the Casco Bay boat, or they didn't want traveling by boat to school, and they started to leave Chebeague. Carol and Ruth Dyer left in 1959. They had 3 children at that time. They had another one later. They moved to Cumberland, where her sister, Phyllis Monahan, who was married to Louis Monahan, who grew up on Chebeague, they had left the island a few years before. Ironically, or interestingly, Carol Dyer, Cal's daughter, and Harvey Monahan, their nephew, were the star basketball players, the girl and boy basketball players at Greeley when they were there. And they got their start on Chebeague. So in 1959, there was another transition. School board started thinking, okay, wait a second, we're spending all this money on tuition to Portland High School. If we could just get rid of Portland High School, we could have them all go to Greeley, and then we wouldn't have to pay tuition. And they were paying several $1,000s to Portland each year. So they had the kids were still going on the Casco Bay boat to Portland, but they had Bill Garso, who was a selectman at the time, in a VW bus, who was coming in and picking them up and getting them on into the boat, into the bus, taking them to Greeley. And they were late for school every day, and they had to leave 45 minutes early. So you can imagine how that disrupted your academics. And Lindy remembers when they first got there, that first group, they brought them all they were late for school. They brought them into a room and they sat them down and they said, no sports or clubs for you, no after school transportation. And that's how they started. And for some of those kids, it was all downhill from there. They'd already made one transition that hadn't gone well, and now they were headed for another one. 1961, Cumberland finally took Sanford's advice and decided that they were going to ship the kids from the Stone Wharf to Cousins. So they contracted with Kip Holman and his boat, the Gloriana, to transport students from the Stone Wharf to Cousins. Now, this photograph shows the Gloriana, which is the large boat in the foreground there, which was a fishing party boat, excursion boat. And it was used during the summer for fishing parties. You see it's here at the public landing in Portland. And it was down at the end of India Street. And on the right, you can see the grain elevators that used to be there, and Munjoy Hills in the background. And so that winter in 1961 was one of the cold winters. In the 60s were, in early 70s, were record breaking all the way along. But Judy told me that it was so cold on that boat, and that in order to get onto the boat some days, they had to go over planks between the old wharf that used to be down next to Chandler's, and they would put planks there, and they'd have to walk over the planks onto the bow of the boat and then scurry down in to go to school. And the girls were supposed to wear dresses, and they would wear pants underneath them because they were having to walk over this situation, this really kind of dangerous situation. So, but there were some benefits of the school boat. It proved year-round commuting was possible via Cousins Island. And before that, no one was commuting from Cousins Island, from Chebeague to Cousins Island. Anybody who worked in Portland was going on the Casco Bay boat. And so what happened is a few people started hitching a ride on the school boat, and he had plenty of room, so that he just took them. And in the fall and spring, Jasper Smith, was already transporting people. But that winter connection allowed people to actually have a job in Portland and to go that way. And they started parking over in Bob Blanchard's yard at Cousins Island. And that is where if you walk into Pogie Shores, where those 3 new houses are, that was the first parking lot where those houses are at Cousins Island. It provided more opportunity to participate in school activities if you could get to Cousins. Because if you could get to Cousins, Kip would give you a ride home. Some of the first baseball players to play over there was Stevie Slowick and Ligon and Leland Hamilton. And they used to hitchhike down to Cousins Island and take a punt and row home in order to play baseball at Greeley. Students could stay, one of the advantages, students could stay till the end of the day. You could actually go through the whole of your last class, and most of the time you got there on time. And so, it also made for a shorter day. Now we're going back to the Chebeague School again. 1964, another limb is cut off the tree. 7th and 8th graders are sent to the mainland. So it's almost like step by step, they're stripping the island of the schools. And so in 1964, there were 4 people who graduated from 8th grade, and that was the last 8th grade to be on Chebeague, and the last 7th grade. From then on, everyone had to go to Greeley Junior High. So you can see, here's my diploma. I told you this was going to be personal. So here's my diploma. It says, Donna Lee Miller has successfully completed the course of study prescribed by the school committee for the elementary school and is therefore entitled to this diploma. 10th day of June, 1964. And our names are, we're in the newspaper. And, that was it. So everybody you see here ended up going to the mainland. So there were challenges of the Inner Bay route. One was the weather. It was during that period of time when I was in school and my brother was in school, and those are the periods I'm going to concentrate on, it was some of the coldest and iciest winters that we've had for a long time. And the boat was a challenge. The girls sat in the cabin with the captain. He had kind of like a little settee. I think it might have been some kind of a bunk, but we could sit there, and he had a heater. The boys had to sit out. If you look at this picture, you'll see Michael Hamilton standing on the side of the boat, and that's canvas behind there. The boys had to sit inside the canvas. And remember, we're talking about day after day of below zero weather, and they had a small coal stove to keep them warm, and that was it. the wharves and floats could be very, very slippery, and not necessarily from snow and ice, but frost. And in 1967, in November, Charlie Kuntz had gotten off the boat. I had gotten off the boat, and the float was covered with frost. Sharon Bowman got off the boat and slipped and fell into the water between the boat and the float. And this is at Cousins Island. We didn't have deckhands on the boat, so the boat wasn't tied up, because we had usually the first person off would tie it up, but we had just gotten off, and so she slid down between them. The kids hollered that she was overboard. The captain got up on the stern looking to try to see where she was. He couldn't move the boat because he was afraid he'd smash into her. And so Charlie and I were trying to get her out of the water when Beth Wiles decided that she needed to help us, and she jumped onto the float and slid across the other side, and Charlie grabbed her just before she went off the other side. So the three of us got Sharon out of the water. In those days, we had to wear dresses, and we had long coats. So when you can imagine how heavy the coat was, covered with water. And my cousin Holly went home with Sharon on the boat because she was really cold. And neither one of them to this day remember how they got from the wharf to their homes. We did wear pants under our clothes, and when we got to school, we would, take them off. But it was really cold. And this isn't one of those stories where you walk to school backwards, uphill, and all that stuff that people make fun of people when they talk about it. This is real. And this is a quote by the superintendent in 1968. It seemed better than taking the risk that some child might slip into the water and under the ice. Okay, so what he's talking about there is kids didn't have to go to school because we had a near catastrophe. And so I'm going to go backwards and tell you about it. Somebody's in the way. So we were coming home from school. I had a gym class last period, and I had sneakers on. And we got on the boat, and this was in January of 1968. And this is a couple of months after Sharon had fallen in the water. And we're on the boat, and he got as far as Little John's Point and got stuck. And he couldn't make the boat go forward, and he couldn't make it go backward. It had frozen in behind the boat. And so finally, somehow he got it around, but he couldn't get into the float at Cousins Island because it was too much ice. So he started and went over toward Sunset that way because the water was moving, and the ice wasn't as thick. In some places, the ice was almost a foot thick. And he and Kip and Smitty would stay up all night long and go back and forth with the boats trying to keep the channel open, but it was just too cold, and it just had frozen in. And so by the time we got around Little Chebeague, it was almost dark. And he had tried to get there in time so that when the Casco Bay boat had come down, because the Casco Bay boat was, steel. Now, I forgot to say that this boat was wood, and it had some copper sheathing on it. It's like a very thin copper sheathing that they'd put on for the winter, which was oftentimes askew. So he was able to get around Little Chebeague and follow the trail that Casco Bay Lines had made into the wharf. But they hadn't gone all the way to the float where the fisherman's wharf was. And that by this time it's dark, and the float was underwater covered with ice. I should have put that picture in too, because we do have a picture of that situation. And one by one, we had to go up to the top and it did low water, and Clyde Bowen, the bus driver, grabbed us. There was a gap, and we all made it. During that time, the people on Chebeague were just beside themselves because, there were probably 15 or 20 of us on the boat, and nobody knew what was going to happen. They couldn't get through to the marine operator. They couldn't get through the Coast Guard. And in the morning, that morning, people were concerned before this happened. And in the morning of that day, Charlie Kuntz, old Charlie, came on the boat and took Sissy off. And she and said, "You're not going to school." And all day long, all the fishermen were going back and forth, talking to each other, trying to figure out how they were going to get the school department to listen to them, that this was not safe. And then here we were stuck in the ice. And this is really a personal story. My mother was talking to her niece, Ruth, Libby Day, who was older than my mother. But anyway, and Ruth said, she said, "Melba, I don't know why you're so worried. That school department has good insurance." And my mother said, "Ruth, I always knew you were a fool, and you've just proven it." Because you can imagine if you've got 2 children on that boat and you don't know if they're going to make it or not. It was, really nip and tuck. But let's look at what the temperature was. January 2nd, -17. And I know that on January 4th, I don't have the statistics here, but I have it in my head, because it was the first day they opened the Greeley pool. And the high that day was 4 above was high. And January 8th was -1, was 1 above, was the high for that day. January 9th, -19. January 11th, the Portland airport showed 20 below, and it was the coldest since 1945. January 12th, it was -18. Later that week was when the bay froze and we got stuck in the ice. And so then this is where politics can interfere with people's education. Because when I got home, I said, "I'm never going to school again," because we were all traumatized. And so my mother got on the phone and she found places for my brother and me to stay in Cumberland. So we went up in the Casco Bay boat, somebody picked us up, and we were all set. But there was a big schism on the island at the time about whether or not a different boat service would be going between Cousins and Chebeague, and whether the water taxi would make it. And it was very contentious. So it took over a week for the school to make arrangements with Casco Bay Lines, because they didn't have the support of all of the people on Chebeague. And so that's why the superintendent said it seemed better than taking the risk that some child might slip into the water and under the ice. So that was better to have kids miss midterms and all of those kinds of things, which doesn't pass a straight face test. And it's one of those things that, it's really hard to believe that would happen. But no, there's nothing written anywhere about us getting stuck in the ice. It's all about, oh, well, maybe somebody would slip. But we all live to see another day. And here it is, graduation day, June 1968. And you see the superintendent giving Sharon Bowman her diploma. You see Smitty and Kip Holman congratulate.
Try again.
Just to let you know, Siri's trying to tell me how to give this talk. So if you hear that. So Smitty and Kip Holman, Kip was the captain of the boat. They're congratulating Michael, who's getting ready to head over to Greeley to, for graduation day. And so you think 6 months from January 1968 to June 1968, That's a big difference of weather. Okay, now we're going to move deja vu to January 1971. We're right back at it again, making all kinds of records. There are 5 records, according to what I found on the internet. 5 records still stand from January 1971 about cold. 4 days in a row, there was a low of more than 20 below. But the good news is the school department had learned from 1968, and they sent the kids to Casco Bay Lines before they got stuck in the ice. So that was really good. They just said, no, we can't do this anymore. And so they just contracted with Casco Bay Lines. It was evident that the inner bay needed a steel hull boat. And after that, at some point after that, Jasper Smith bought the Chebeague and he rigged it for passengers. And eventually he took over from Kip Holman, but that's another whole story. But eventually that helped to solve the problem. And then of course the Islander, but the Islander didn't come until 1984. So it was a long time where they had the Dorigo and the Chebeague. And as I said, that's another story. Here's in this picture, this is from the newspaper, January 1991. You see the Gloriana tied up over at Cousins Island. You can see where they tried to keep it open, but the ice is coming back in. It's solid all the way to Chebeague. And some people were already walking across the ice at that time. So one of the headlines was Frozen Channel. I found this on the web. Frozen Chebeague Channel inconveniences Islanders. Well, it didn't just inconvenience people, it was downright dangerous. But so here's the quote from the next superintendent, Mort Hamlin, and many people on here may remember Mort. He said, Captain Eldon Holman, who we call Kip, who operates the school boat, plied back and forth between Chebeague and Cousins Island all night Wednesday, trying to keep the channel open, but it froze faster than he could keep up with it. Hamlin said the Coast Guard sent out an icebreaker Saturday, but the wind blew the ice back into the area and it froze solid again. And so that was the rationale for sending the kids Casco Bay Lines, and that's January 18th, 1971, in the Evening Express. And island residents had reported that the ice was all piled up on the mainland side of Chebeague. Now, and people had walked across. Now, I can tell you that winter, there were times when the ice started to go out, there was still a lot of ice. But when they talk about piled up, they're talking about 6 foot, 6 foot high and more, these giant pieces of ice that looked like little mini icebergs that were on the shore. And one night, I actually, you do things that are really stupid when you're young. Well, probably none of you have ever done something stupid, but one of my stupid things was Gunnar Woody and I went to the movies, and we came back and rode across through the ice cakes in one of those little prams that Bob Dyer used to make, or Smitty, one or the other. I can't remember which ones it was. And we couldn't get in down in by Carter's Point on the beach. We had to go to the end of the point and then carry the punt up through the seaweed and the icebergs. And that's how I know that those icebergs were gigantic. This is what happened to the Cousins Island wharf during that icy period. It took out the crib that was in between. You can see how there's like a slump in it. And according to the newspaper, it cost $1,000 to get it fixed. Now, it'd probably cost $1 million to get it fixed today. But during that winter, or during January, my brother was a senior in high school and I had an apartment in Portland, and he came and stayed with me. And every morning he would go down to Casco Balance. It was about an 8 to 10 minute fast walk run, and it was below zero every single morning that he went down there. So now, 1965, the next cohort at the island school. So what I'm trying to do is just kind of pick a point in the middle of a decade. And so in this picture, you've got, this is between the two pictures, it was the whole school. 29 students, of 29 students, 11, 38% stayed on Chebeague. So that was 38% of the kids who were in these two pictures together stayed on Chebeague. Of those 6, 55% became lifelong fishermen. So you can see that when fishing was a draw to be staying here.
Is there something else I can help with?
I'm having a real problem because Siri keeps trying to get involved in my discussion here. So out migration, this is something, to be thinking about. So that old saying about World War I, how do you keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Well, this is my take on it. How do you keep them down on the rock after they've seen the mainland life and risk their lives going to school? Good question. You don't, because there's a lot of reasons why a lot of these kids did not come back here to live. In 1975, you had 36 students, including 5 kids of the first generation of Greeley grads. So all of a sudden you're seeing, the next generation. 8 are living on Chebeague today, 22%. And these kids, if they wanted to be involved in activities at school, had to pay their own way home on the boat in order to come home. And today, when you think about the opportunities that the kids have, it's just amazing how much better they have it than these kids who commuted earlier on. One of the things that was really interesting in the 1970s was there was a woman in Cumberland who was involved in the school department, and she wrote a grant for Project Mainstream, and it was to bring kids with disabilities. It provided preschool activities for kids with disabilities. It was a government program, and she got the idea, in order to have enough people, she included the Chebeague school. Well, the problem was they didn't have enough kids with disabilities. They had hardly anybody with disabilities. So they came up with socially disadvantaged, which was a criteria. And so they gave everyone what is now an IEP. And their IEP was they were socially disadvantaged because they lived on Chebeague. What was good about it is they had a federally funded preschool that was free, and they had a teacher who came over here. And those kids really had a good advantage. Of course, some people, thought, well, they should have been able to do it without being socially disadvantaged. But anyway, that's the way it goes. So then now we're in the 1980s. The next generation, the baby boomlet. So you've got the kids who are the children of the baby boomers. Every island child from birth through 6th grade is in this photograph who lived on Chebeague. Of the 30 kids, only 7 live on Chebeague today, which is 23%. 50% of the first generation, 50% of these children in this picture are of the first generation Greeley grads. Their parents, one of their parents was a Greeley graduate. Strong parent participation was really evident for this cohort of people. And they were trying to make their kids' experience better than what they had had when they had to go to the mainland. And the Island Institute this was the very early days of the Island Institute, and their programming really fit right in. They really recognized for the first time that transitioning from an island school to a mainland school was difficult. Sharon Bowman and I went to a conference on North Haven Island in 1985, 86, I'm sorry. And we sat there, and I mean, I had tears forming in my eyes because somebody actually had a workshop on how to make transitions better for kids. No one would even listen to us that it was a thing. And all of a sudden, the Island Institute and other people on other islands had validated what we had known all along. During this time, it built capacity in civic involvement. The parents of these students became much more active in the community and in trying to do things that would make things better for their children, including advocating with the school department to put kids first in the CTC contract, to add money in there so they didn't have to pay their way home. And so eventually some of those opportunities have gotten better and better and better for kids. And the parents of this era, the kids benefited from the parents ran their own preschool that they self-funded. Now we're in the 1990s, K through 6. These are between the two pictures, it's everyone K through 6, about 30 students. And 14 had parents who went to school on Chebeague, about 50%. 5 of them live here today. You can see that the patterns are very similar. And then 2005, we have K through 5, 22 pupils. 6th grade had gone that year to Greeley Middle School. So we lost another grade. So we were down to, remember, we started this at K through 12, and now we're down to K through 5. You can see another pattern forming. There were 9 children of former students, 41%. And out of these kids, out of the 22, only 3 live on Chebeague. Will some move back? That's a question. So what happens in 2005? School district may reorganize Chebeague School. Some islanders fear school may close. This is when SAD 51 decided that they were going to send the 4th and 5th graders to the mainland without telling any of the parents before they contacted the school and the teachers. And I have firsthand knowledge of this because I was in the teacher's room at Greeley High School. The gym teacher was there. She was teaching swimming, and she was looking at her email, and she said, "Wow, I didn't know they were going to send the 4th and 5th graders from Chebeague to the mainland next year." And I said, "How do you know that?" And she said, "Oh, they just put out an announcement on our school mail." I went in and called Carol White, and she knew nothing about it. She had children in the school at that time. The next call I made was to the forecaster. And I said, "You need to find out what's going on here." And that was the catalyst for secession, because you saw the pattern of one after grade after grade after grade going to the mainland, and then to not tell the parents that you were even considering it. And to put it in context, in the November of the previous year, the school board had been on Chebeague, and there was a lot of discussion about tax caps and all that. And one parent raised their hand and said, "Well, you would never consider closing the Chebeague school." And one of the school board members said, "Everything is on the table." And so when they heard everything was on the table, added to the fact that they were going to send the 4th and 5th grade to the mainland without telling anybody, that was the red flag. And so there's a whole series of articles that you can find about how this built up. And they didn't take it seriously at first, because this was the notice that went out was afternoon on the Friday before February vacation. And so during February vacation, all the school board members, the administration, nobody answered their telephones. And so people in Chebeague got more and more concerned. And the Monday after vacation, I was on the Cumberland Town Council and I was at a meeting where the chairman of the school board was there. And I went back to the Freeport Inn and called her house and talked to her because I knew she would answer the phone because she was just going home. And I told her, I said, you are planting the seed for secession. And she said, oh, you really think so? And I said, I just don't want, if this goes forward, I don't want anybody to say I haven't warned you. Because for years, people had said, do you think Chebeague will ever secede? And I said, it will take a tax increase and a political blunder. And here was the political blunder, and we'd had the tax increase 2 years before. And so this is, I'm just going to kind of zoom through this because this secession is its own talk, but it all ties into the school. And I don't believe that Chebeague would have ever become its own town if that hadn't happened. And this is interesting. Chebeague secession worthwhile if parting is amicable. What was amicable was if we paid the ransom, the money, as long as we paid plenty of money and didn't get our fair share of the assets on the mainland, everybody was amicable. And so that's really what happened. And we're getting close to paying off the debt. And here we are, Baldacci grants Island its freedom. And here you see Beverly coming off the boat after Chebeague had won its independence. And you all have heard the story about Mabel saying it's time to row our own boat. And then the next thing that happened with education is here you see a picture, and this is 2015 was the last graduation, one of the last of Chebeague's Greeley graduates. You see Dylan there getting his diploma. And that year, the graduation was dedicated in memory of William Robinson, who had died in the fall before. And you see there's a picture of William on the table and Sweet William around the plant Sweet William around the candle. And so because the Chebeague School Board had decided to send school kids to Yarmouth before the SAD 51 contract was up, citing programming and convenience. And so they had negotiated a deal with SAD 51 where we had, so I can't remember how many years we had, that we paid X number of dollars, X millions of dollars for, and part of that was sending the kids, there would be no additional charge for them to go. And so the school board studied both school districts and made the decision to go with Yarmouth. And so for a while, they let the kids who were already at Greeley stay at Greeley, and the ones coming in went to Yarmouth. And here's a picture of Jonathan Grutoff, who was one of Chebeague's first Yarmouth graduates. And so here we have the Chebeague Island School, 1953, and then with the new addition in 2019. So just to remember, in 1953, there were 53 students, subprimary through 12. In 2024, there were 36 students, pre-K through 12. And today, there's 13 at the Chebeague School and about 20 who commute. So now we're back at the beginning, and did you find out how the kids made out at Portland High, how they ended up at Greeley, what happened to the Chebeague Junior High, what was it like to cut ice in a wooden boat, and how did a school decision result in secession, and how did the Chebeague kids end up at Yarmouth? And so now I just want to make a quick reflection, and then we'll go to questions. Dorothy Simpson wrote The Main Islands, and it's actually in the section about Long Island. But there's a quote that I found it when I was a freshman in high school, and I've used it over and over. Yet there is a difference. There are some who cannot forget what their ancestors knew in this place, the remoteness and the imperviousness of the sea, a sense of being an islander, and in some ways different from all men. And so, my question to myself was, am I glad that I grew up on Chebeague? You bet. And how, the next question is, how would my kids feel? And I think they're glad that they grew up on Chebeague. But will they or their kids come back? Who knows? But interestingly enough, as I was putting this together, I realized both sets of my grandparents left Chebeague and came back, just as I did. But it is really difficult when you're trying to have one foot in each boat. If you're trying to be living on Chebeague and you're trying to also be part of a mainland high school community. And it was much worse when I was in high school. I spent 92 nights away from home. And if you had asked me then, I would say I would never live on Chebeague, and I would never subject my children to living on Chebeague. And I started to resent it because I just wanted to be like everybody else. In the 7th grade, I read 100 books, and they were all those teen romance books where you go to high school and you have all this fun. And that's what I thought high school was supposed to be. And I was at the University of Maine at Orono when I was a sophomore, and we were just sitting around, and I said how much I hated living on Chebeague. And one of my friends said, how can you hate a place that you have so many wonderful stories and you have such great people and you tell us all about them? I mean, I felt like Wendy in Peter Pan. And all of a sudden the light bulb went on that I didn't hate living on Chebeague. What I did was I didn't like the inconvenience that I had to go through. And it helped me to kind of reconcile what it's like to be disrupted from your life and transported to something else. And anyway, I'm back, and here's pictures of my grandparents, me with my parents and my kids. And, maybe someday somebody else will come back. Maybe they won't. But we have a lot of people who have moved here who are making this place great. We have a lot of and hopefully some of these kids will come back who are going to school here now today. And so, questions. We're going to unmute everybody, and Richard, can you make me have a gallery thing?
It's not sharing the screen.
Okay.
There and they have to unmute themselves.
And you all have to unmute yourselves if you want to unmute yourselves. And just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Polly?
Hi, how are you?
Good.
That was quite a walk down memory lane.
See, Polly lived through that same life, so she's my reality check. I'm sure I got stuff screwed up, but
You did pretty well. Do you remember the morning that the hose slipped off the heater
I
in
forgot.
the cabin of the Gloriana?
And it was steaming. Yeah.
It was antifreeze. It was hot antifreeze, and I had on an warmer coat. And Holman grabbed my shoulders and said, "You stand right there. The rest of you get out." And then I had to move, and yeah, that was great fun. But when Sharon went over, that was quite a trip to the system.
Yeah, not many people have to see that on the way to school.
There was a story too, Donna, about the boat getting stuck in the ice early on, like before we went over. I don't know if Lindy was still there, but anyhow, Holman was, I think, maybe trying to take people over, and the ice was going out. and this big flow of ice jammed the Gloriana, and the tide was going out, and it was carrying around the East End Point.
Oh my
And
gosh.
Holman called the Coast Guard and said, I'm in trouble here. You need to send an icebreaker. And I said, well, maybe we'll send it down tomorrow. He says, I got a boatload of kids and we're headed for Spain. You've got to do something. Yep. Yes, there are great stories.
Anyone else have any questions or comments? Let's see. I don't see anybody. So, somebody raised their hand. Who is it?
Russell.
Oh, hi, Russell. Can you unmute, Russell?
Yeah, we know that Chebeaguers have lost their lives at sea, but I'm surprised that no one lost their lives struggling, trying to keep those channels open, working all night, for example, or rowing back over to the island to get back after a long day at school. There were evidently no fatalities during that era that you described.
No. Fortunately, no. Anyone else?
Hi, Donna. It's Ruthie Hackenberger Noble. I just wanted to let you know that I just found the story not the story, the factual recall of those years so completely fascinating. And as a Greeley graduate of 1979 and I became a year-rounder on Chebeague in 1975. And I experienced some of the crazy commuting experiences on my own. And as a kid from California who had not had the, I really came unprepared. But what I find interesting is that arriving at Greeley in the middle of winter by way of Casco Bay lines, which happened probably usually during the midterms when it was really dicey for you to miss time arriving at high school. And there was a lot of I guess discrimination that was set up by the administrators. There would be an announcement to let the entire high school know that the Greeley students were going to be late again today and probably leaving early, and everyone would moan and groan, and we would all arrive, having been through some pretty crazy stuff, well before the hours of daylight, and departing on the earlier side. But we tried to do the best we could, and I just find that your experience was 10 times I feel like we got somehow the limo ride compared to what the Chebeaguers of your generation experiences and those before. So much to take away, and I will be sharing some of those stories with my Greeley classmates when I see them for lunch on Thursday.
Well, thank you, Ruthie. Polly remembers this, but it wasn't uncommon. They would call us to the office at the end of the day, or like near the end, and give us dollar bills so that we could get home on the Casco Bay boat.
Oh,
They didn't
boy.
have, I guess they didn't have a charge account there or something, but I can remember them passing out money.
Oh my goodness.
Anybody else? Well, you see anybody?
Bill Daniels.
Oh, Bill Danielson. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Donna. I just want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. I think all four of us here, Esther and Bill and Pips and I, are all on information overload at this point. We've been here such a short time, and there's just so much to learn about. But you've done a fabulous job in getting us started on this. And so thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, next month, maybe Mary can tell us who, I can't remember. Who's speaking next month? Because I wrote the notice, but I can't remember what was my mind. Speaking about overload. Mary, can you unmute and tell us
Yes,
what's happening
Yes.
next month?
Next month, you have Rachel, who's going to be speaking
Oh,
about
right.
her research. You know a bit more about that. So if you could
Okay.
share that.
So it's Rachel, but it's not my Rachel. It's not Rachel Reiser. It's Rachel Church, and she is the granddaughter of Tom and Beverly Merrill. And Tom was the minister here in the late 60s, late 50s and early 60s. And Beverly was involved in making the cookbook that is the white one with the blue boats on it that I think probably almost every Chebeague kitchen has. And if you don't, this is an infomercial. You can buy them at the Chebeague Islands Historical Society. But, you know, we just have to have those plugs. But anyway, she is a PhD candidate at USM, and she has just written a paper that, an article that was published in the Maine Historical Society's Quarterly, which is a very prestigious publication. And it's about community cookbooks, and it features the Chebeague Island cookbook. And her grandmother is the last person on that committee who's still living. And so she has agreed. She was so excited when I asked her if she would talk about it. And so she's going to be on talking about community cookbooks. And we're hoping this would stimulate some interest in some of you out there who want to be volunteers and help us make a new Chebeague cookbook for the Historical Society. I see some heads going, and it could be really fun. And Beth McNulty had the great idea of it could be things you can buy at the store. And then we started brainstorming, and we said, and we've got all these store books, and it could be like things you could make in the 1860s. And, you know, so anyway, we would love to have some participation in that. And if you can tune into that meeting in February, it will be in the calendar. It'll be on Beverly's website and on our website. So, yeah, that's the advertisement. All right. Anybody else? Rich is going to give you one last shot here. And I just want to say it's nice to see some of my relatives and some of my longtime friends, especially some of my Greeley friends. And I saw Pam Ames on here, and I could not have had the high school experience I had without people like Pam, and who welcomed me into their homes. Those 92 nights I spent on the mainland. My best record, I might as well tell you this too. I slept at one house. I had supper at one house, slept someplace else. We had a pajama party, had breakfast someplace else, lunch someplace else, supper someplace else, and slept someplace else. Now that's sleeping around. And my mother knew where I was all of the time, because I see my cousin Valerie shaking her head because she knows my mother. And so even though my mother was separated by the ocean and didn't have a driver's license, she was still in charge. So thank you all for coming. And we hope to see you next month.
Very good.
Bye,
Very good.
everybody.
Thank you.